Thank you, John. Thank you to all the panelists for a very inspiring discussion. Pour les prochains 15 minutes, je serai avec mon ami Carlos Lopes.
For the next 15 minutes, I will be with the person responsible for the Economic Commission. He's from Equatorial Guinea. And no, he's from Guinea-Bissau. And so I was thinking about my friend Rafael, so excuse me. And in fact, he's just had a new head of state, if I believe so. And we could talk about that perhaps later. And so we're going to have a 10-minute conversation with him. And for 5 minutes, you will be able to ask questions to Carlos, because we've already seen him at the opening session, how inspiring he was, and especially for our continent. And yesterday, you were saying that we have a lot of favorable things here in Africa, but we have to know how to take advantage of them. So how can this lead us to some good ideas? Because if we just have meetings after meetings, and we say the financing is here and we have growth and so on is good, but what exactly, concretely, can we do? And how can we go towards our objectives, towards the objective with real results? Well, I'd like to begin with a question, a demographic issue, because we speak about this a lot, but yes, this is one of your favorite subjects. Absolutely, because if we don't know how to use these demographics, then of course we can lose a lot of opportunities. Now, demography is quite interesting, because when Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 250 years ago, he spoke of the social contract. In fact, he was making a description of what we would call today sustainable development. In other words, the relationship between man and nature, and the question of solidarity. And he also spoke of the way in which solidarity should evolve in the family level, and for instance, in terms of the nation. And so today, if we take into consideration the basic principles that he foresaw, we can speak of the intergenerational relationship and solidarity. In the future, this should take place between the young people and the older people, but it should also take place at a world level, in other words, between the different countries. And in other words, the continent, which is the youngest in the world, which is Africa, should sign sort of a social contract with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world will be older. And who will be the Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Africa? Well, I don't know, but I think that it's a way of trying to foresee different opportunities that can be seen through mega tendencies, and also the problems that we might have in terms of establishing a relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, which would be quite different. Because today we sort of criminalize immigration or emigration, and of course it's a sort of a human phenomenon. And so we have to see how could we take advantage of this immigration. And I think there are ways of doing so. Concerning Africa, I think it would be very interesting to be able to repatriate some of these people the way the Chinese have been doing, and the way India has been doing. The diaspora should come home. Well, not just physically come home, but should at least come back in terms of participation, in terms of the capital and the investments, and especially their connections. Well, as we are listening to you, Carlos, we have a tendency, and of course I'm convinced that you're right, but I'd like to talk about this for a minute. You say that Africa should be industrialized. And industrialized not just with gigantic projects, but in order to go towards something more durable and to create jobs. Could you possibly develop concretely exactly how Africa and certain countries in Africa should launch this process of industrialization? Because we can see that Europe is losing its industries. The United States is losing its industries. We're all talking about the back to manufacturing. China has been succeeding wonderfully. So how can you do it in Africa? Well, it's not just a coincidence that we speak of developed countries and countries that are there industrialized. But if we can put our finger on the most important thing, it would be the transformation of the economy, going from a low value to a higher value added products, to go from just a collective activities to transformational activities, because when Europe had their industrial revolution, and we could begin with England, there were elements that were quite favorable for this industrialization. Among those elements, I'd like to say that one of the most important was the African labor, which were, of course, had a very low level of production compared to other ways of producing. But the reality of Africa is that we are very, very far from the Industrial Revolution that took place in Europe in the 19th century, but it's still the same model. In other words, the idea of producing those raw materials and then to somehow transform them for others. In other words, Africa can try to go very quickly go through the European Revolution and then go through other revolutions very quickly. In other words, for instance, the revolution taking place in Asia. In other words, we can look at all the products that are available in Africa. We've got to change our model because we have very interesting elements for the development of our model. First of all, we know the value of our raw materials, and we know that we're losing a lot in terms of the transactions that are now taking place by just selling them, even if we add the transformational value because of the value that we're exporting. And so if we can better negotiate those contracts, in fact, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, because are we bad negotiators? What is the problem? Do we allow other countries to impose their dictatorship? No, it's the ignorance. And it's, for instance, we don't have the right to information. Sometimes it's corruption. There's a whole series of different elements. And so there's a lot of African responsibility and this bad negotiations that are taking place. But that's just one aspect. Now, another aspect is that we could propulse our own industrialization with renewable energies. And we could have, for instance, a proposal for the world which would take into consideration climate change, because we have one of the biggest potentials in terms of renewable energy. And even just the hydrocarbons, I believe or even water sources, we just use 5% of what Africa actually could produce potentially. And in terms of just, for instance, sun power, just 3% we could actually export energy. And so I think we have a huge potential. In other words, in Morocco, you have a huge potential in terms of, and it's just a drop in the bucket of what we could produce. We have a geothermal energy, renewable energy. Also, we are not married to any kind of a specific technological platform, and so therefore, we could go towards highly performing technologies which are quite much cleaner. And we could also, in terms of technological novel, I believe we already have a lot in order to be able to produce differently. And as it was said yesterday, I think that this technology, we can acquire it. It's very easy. And so there's no problem here. We have the capital, we can acquire it. And then the last aspect, which is perhaps the most important, is that the countries for the past 20 years, for instance, have been supplying the mass consumption for the industrial world. These countries are sort of broken down because of the social demands that are increasing, for instance, in China. And so I think for the lower added value activities, I think that they're going to have to transfer those technological transformation to other areas. And of course, Africa is very attractive for them because, and then of course, the last aspect is the industrialization is the only answer to some of the social problems in Africa, because it is the only one that can generate jobs in the quantity and the quality that is required. And now just another little illustration of what you were saying. I was struck in Kigali with the General Assembly of the African Development Bank. I was struck with what was happening in Ethiopia, where a young Chinese business person was speaking. Yes, I know him. In fact, he told us about an illustration of what you have just mentioned, that Ethiopia was one of the first exporters of leather to China. And then all of a sudden, they said this leather goes to China. It makes shoes that they come back to Africa. And so why wouldn't we be transforming those shoes? And we could use the competency of the Chinese, but we can set up the factory in Africa. And so we've already created 400 jobs in Addis Ababa, and they're now making shoes, and those shoes are now being exported towards China. And so this is a very concrete example of how we can create jobs in Africa. We also have sort of an idea of Africa, that Africa is always receiving assistance. And so now you see that this financial assistance is decreasing in the world. So how could we somehow come up and meet some of those needs that are no longer being met by the international community? Well, I think that the assistance for development has been concentrated on a certain number of social priorities, which are important for the continent. And of course, they've also caused a lot of damage. Okay, if we just take the example of agriculture, to give an example, we have $1.5 billion that have been invested in African agriculture during the past 20 years, just for assistance in terms of development. And the tonnage per hectare that is being produced as an indicator of African development has not developed for 20 years. And why not? Because this assistance is based on food security and the struggle against poverty. It's not an assistance that would allow agriculture to become an economic area of activity. In other words, it's not the kind of help that's going to transform the agricultural economy in Africa. And so we have the same sort of thing in other areas of the economy. Today, the assistance is, well, there's very little, only $50 billion for the entire continent of Africa. For instance, during the best time, I think we had $70 billion coming to Africa, the entire economy. But right now, the transfer of immigrants, I think, is about $60 billion. So I think the Africans that are in the United States and in Europe, they're actually contributing more to the African continent from the diaspora than actually those international donor organizations. So, but for the time being, it's not that productive. We have $600 billion that are in reserve funds in the central banks here in Africa. We cannot use that money in Africa because the IMF has a classification which would obligate all this money to go into different AAA financial vehicles, and these are not available in Africa, and so except if it goes through indirect ways, but they're in treasury bonds in the United States or in Europe, for instance. And so we have $80 billion in the commercial banks here in Africa, and which are not being used for different investments because they're making a lot of money in terms of repurchasing the national debts and so on. So they're not really interested in a more productive activity. We have the sovereign funds. So if we put together all these different elements, plus which is considered the most important, which is the money which is lost by the Africans because of the transfer of their raw materials, which, of course, they're being sold at very cheap prices. I think it's $60 billion that is being lost. And if we put all of this together, I think we have a situation where Africa has $1 trillion, which they're not using. And you have a situation, for instance, where in Algeria you have $200 billion in the reserves, and only Algeria itself, they could even flood the Western African market with capital. So I think that the time has come for Africa to be capable of using its own resources. Thank you very much, Carlos, for this commentary, and I hope my friend John Quesh, who's going to be following me, and he's going to be talking about sovereign funds. It's going to be very interesting funds. I hope he'll bring up this point, and I'll have them talk about this in terms of their different sovereign funds that they're directing. So I'd also like to welcome the arrival of the Prime Minister of the Gabonese Republic. Good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. And this, his comments will come directly after the next panel. So we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. Are there any questions that you would like to ask? We'd like to have a microphone over here. Microphone for the second rank over here. Okay, if you could please introduce yourself, sir, and please formulate your question very briefly. Good morning. My question is Mr. Gomez. I'm also from Bissau, Guinea, and I'm very, very proud to have Mr. Carlos here, who represents at a very high level my country. And so a very simple question. I think that the different challenges that have been brought up in terms of demographic challenges, I'd like to point out two aspects that worry me a lot. For instance, during this past month and the political situation in my country. The first one is the pillage of the resources, and Carlos talked about the value of our raw materials. And I think that we have to have an exercise where we can have a very clear evaluation of the value of our resources, because we don't even know exactly what our raw materials represent. And so I think that we have to have a sort of a deepened study of the value of our resources and even the existence of these resources to be able to monetize them. And the second concern I have is the pillage of these resources, because we have a phenomenon which is incredible of pillaging of our marine resources, and it goes beyond just the boats that come and do illegal fishing in our waters, but it also has to do with the different agreements that we have with the European community. In other words, we have to think about this. And the third one, it is the phenomenon of drugs. And Carlos talked to us about this yesterday, the different aspects that we have in common with the Latin American countries. My country has become a platform, sort of a transit area for the passage of drugs. So I think that we've got a very frank discussion on this issue. And I don't think, I'm not talking about the legalization of this phenomenon, because there is an important commission with Kofi Annan and the presidents of Latin America who talked about the legalization of this. And I'm not ready to go that far. But I think that it's very important that there should be a very frank debate on this issue, because this phenomenon of drugs is beginning to penetrate our entire country and all the other countries in Africa at every level. And we have some weak governments, and they cannot confront this problem. And so we've got to talk about this. I don't know what the solutions are, but my country by itself cannot confront this problem. And of course, I myself was a candidate in the elections in my country. I was number 3 in terms of the presidential elections. And of course, we cannot solve this problem of drugs if we do not discuss this drug solution on a national level, on a continental level. Thank you. Yes, I think we can applaud his comments, and I absolutely am going to bring that up in our next panel discussion. Thank you very much for your comment. And we have another question over here in the 6th row. Please, this is microphone number 4. And this will be the last question, because we will have other questions that you will have to pose in the panel discussion on sovereign funds. Thank you, Mr. ATTIAS. My name is Rit Mendu. I'm the director of Vox Africa TV, and this is a Pan-African channel. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Carlos, because I met him recently at Rabat. Is one of the most brilliant spirits and minds in Africa. And in fact, following the conversation that we had, I'd like to come back to an issue and an opinion that you have, which is the idea of the transformation in Africa. Because you said that we should not just depend on political people, the presidents, because yesterday we had the different presidents, Kagame and Bongo, and of course they have a very important leadership, and we need people who have visions and are directing countries. But Carlos thought that it would be necessary to have other visions. Okay, Carlos, would you like to make a comment? Yes. I'd like to, say hello to my colleague and to congratulate him for his results of being number 3 in the presidential elections in my country. But of course, the most important is that he is a young person, and he has tried to win without a party. So please continue in the political area. I think you're very courageous. I think that the question that he brought up concerning the different aspects is really this illegal traffic, and how this illegal traffic is responsible for the loss of opportunities in different countries like Guinea-Bissau, because it's the smallest economy in all of Africa. And we just have 1.5 million in population, and we have the smallest economy in Africa. But maybe that is one of the reasons why I'm quite mobilized. We're going to change that. And so I think that one of the reasons that we have this situation is because we have a phenomenon where different conflicts are propulsed by this illegal trafficking of drugs. And so we have to absolutely change this. It's like in Latin America, absolutely. And so this brings a lot of problems to our country and a lot of other African countries too. So Richard, if you can do something about this, yes, I think so. And in fact, on the 21st of September in New York, in the New York Forum, we're going to be doing that with your contribution, I hope. And also, in terms of the question that was just concerning leadership, I really am among those who believe that it's important to have presidents who have visions, who are capable of carrying out a program that is solid in terms of the transformation of their countries. But I think that if we wait until just one particular president should have all those qualities, I think we're not going to have time with the speed that is necessary. That's utopic. And so therefore, I think that we have to account on the different agents of transformation. And these agents, it could be a minister, it could be a private business person, it could be a social activist, it could be an intellectual who has a very important conception from the diaspora, absolutely. And so I think that we're going to have to somehow create the conditions so that we're not going to depend just on the political leadership of presidents. I think that we have to be able to mobilize all the different capacities that exist in Africa, have a gigantic potential that it exists already in our continent. And I think that we mustn't even imagine that we're just going to depend on a few leaders. And with the contribution of Carlos and others, I think we can do that. Thank you very much.
I am Africa.